Chartered Institute of Taxation of Nigeria, CITN, is the issue of tax holidays. Currently, about 107 companies are benefiting from the federal government's tax exemption. And, there are pros and cons to this issue. At the time when the country seeks revenue to handle some national issues, or some are arguing if we should be treading this path at this time. But let's discuss this with a partner at Tax Services, Stransact, and he is also a chartered accountant and an auditor. Joins us here in the studio, Mr. Victor Athe. Mr. Athe, good afternoon, and thank you for your time.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
So, do you worry with the Chartered Institute of Taxation that at this time we shouldn't be talking about tax holidays, waivers, exemption, whichever name you want to give it?
Okay, so the issue of tax holidays, one will have to look at very delicately. Now, the whole idea of tax holidays is to drive investment, right? It's a strategic initiative of government to encourage, more investment in the economy. However, I do think, from my experience, in what I've seen play out in Nigeria so far, that there is a need, after granting tax holidays is just not enough, right? We have to go back periodically as a nation to see whether the objectives of these tax holidays have been achieved. How do we do that? When you grant tax holidays, you expect a commensurate level of investment, or a level of investment that will bring benefits to the government, right? So it's not enough to have tax holiday schemes or incentives. There is a need for government to periodically do an assessment of whether the country is reaping, benefits, the expected benefits from these tax incentives. And on a case-by-case basis, right, we can now determine whether some incentives should be, set aside, things like that.
And we haven't been doing the assessment, or have we?
Yeah, so I think that's where we're lacking. There's a need for that assessment to be periodically done in an objective manner, right? It's not enough to talk about these things. There has to be action. There has to be a concerted, proper plan of action to ensure that Nigeria, we're not losing revenue from tax incentive schemes.
So we have the Presidential Committee on Fiscal Policy and Tax Reform, but it seems they've been busy. They've been kind of quiet for some months now. Or perhaps I'm the one who has not been followed up. Should this be part of their responsibility?
Yeah, absolutely. If you recall, the chairman of the committee earlier, when he gave a quick win report, to the president, I think sometime last year, they made it clear, right, that their work will be in phases, because it's a whole lot of work to do. When you talk about tax reforms, fiscal policy, it's a whole lot. They have to look at a whole lot of issues, right? I think the next phase, I think they have about 6 months. They based on what I understand, they have 6 months to come up with their progress report. Of course, it's going to take time. It's not something that we're going to be able to see very quickly. It's going to take time for them to come up with their report. They have to examine a lot of things, box of incentives, ease of doing business, look at the various tax laws and all of that.
So last year there was the Finance Act 2023. And then, you had the issue of enhancing compliance and enforcement modalities around taxation. And, we talk about AI, for instance. We talk about, I think there's a voice, there's a part that you're supposed to use a voice prompting also, all of them to boost, because we know the government has come to say they are not looking to increase tax, but to enlarge the tax net. We've been talking about technology in the tax space for a while. Are we moving? Are we making movements?
Yeah. So when you come to the issue of technology, we all know for Nigeria, it's relatively nascent, right? Applying technology to improving tax collections is something is also going to take time. Of course, the efforts in the right direction. The
Have we had movements recorded?
Yes.
Yeah, there's the digitization and provision of interactive voice response intercom services. All of that's supposed to make it easier.
Yes. Technology is work in progress. It requires a lot of investments, right? We all know the Federal Inland Revenue Service is investing a lot, right? I mean, they designed internally a system for collecting taxes, which is called the Tax Pro Max, right? So I think that's a step in the right direction. But bringing in the issue of AI to tax collection is going to take quite some time, right? It's not something we're going to see immediately, but I'm sure. I understand that there are ongoing efforts along that line.
So what about states? I know Lagos State, they are quite, ahead when it comes to adopting this technology. And what about other states? Do you know if they are also? I think Kaduna also is a state that has embraced a lot of technology and this voice interactive. But do you have an idea, other states?
Okay, so now the issue is integrating technology for states, right, will be paucity of data, right? And that's a national issue. It's one thing to develop a technology. It's another thing to make sure you get the technology to cut across, the majority of the tax base that you envisage, right? Now, for states, it's a bit complicated, right? Because they're battling with revenue generation. They have a lot of funding deficits that they are battling with, and they're not generating much, right? So for states, it's a bit complicated, right? Because a lot of states are not producing maximally. They're not. The internal revenue generation is not yet there. So it's going to be a complicated issue. I think there has to be a way of improving data collection. Right, that's the only way investment in technology can pay off.
Yeah, but you still have at the bottom of it the issue of trust. Nigerians will ask how accountable are the government on different levels. In the management of taxes. Do we see what they're using it for? That will be a motivation to embrace the system even more.
Absolutely, you're spot on there. The issue of trust also is related to what I call tax morale, right? How easy is it for a taxpayer to comply willingly, right? So that speaks to the issue of trust. If I don't trust, tax creates what is called a fiscal or social contract. And we know in every typical contract, you want to be sure the other party is doing their own part of the bargain, right? So for taxpayers generally, the issue of trust is still a big deal. It's something that will not just go away by we just talking about it. Government has to demonstrate, right? Government has to end this trust by demonstrating to the masses and showing the masses. We have to see, taxpayers in general have to see what their money is being put in use. And disturbing headlines like the ones we've had in the past about a sitting governor, doing all sorts of involved in corrupt practices. We have to move away from that life. So I think it's a general mindset shift that government has to champion with results. It's not just enough to talk about it. We have to see that government is willing. That
the
willpower. We have to see that, from what government does, how resources are allocated, how resources are spent. It's not just enough to borrow, for instance. The question is, what are we borrowing for? What is the borrowing used for? And so that also speaks to the issue of debt to GDP ratio, tax to GDP ratio, and all of that. So when you have high debt to GDP ratio, one should expect that if debt is put to proper use, right, then we should see the gains, and with time, the tax to GDP ratio should also increase.
Yeah, but even the International Lending Agency, IMF, World Bank, they've said that tax rates are really low compared to a lot of countries and all of that. So it seems we're still getting away with some things.
Yeah. So very correct. Yeah, tax rates is low. We have so the point is we have. Nigeria has capacity to generate a whole lot more taxes than we're doing currently, right? But so it's about different issues. The trust issues there, the fact that businesses, corporate businesses, individuals are really not willing, to pay tax because they're not convinced, right, that the
So
tax
back
is
to
put
the
to proper
trust
use.
issue.
Back to the trust issue. Then there is the issue of systems, tax administration, right? How so? In my experience as a tax professional, I see that government increasingly puts scrutiny on existing taxpayers, payers already in the tax net, right? Meanwhile, there's a whole lot of, opportunities to bring in more into the tax net. So the question is, what are we doing? Are there systems in place to widen the tax net? Because it's not fair to continue to, put burden on existing taxpayers that, to be fair, doing their bits to comply, because these guys are already in tax net. When the file returns, you go after them. The question is, what is government doing to widen? So you talk about
which is one of the responsibility of the reforms committee, the
Fantastic.
presidential committee. They're supposed to widen the tax net, and it's not a matter of increasing taxes.
Exactly. That's one of the things the reform committee is working on. But I tell you, that's not it's not easy as it appears. On the surface, it's a whole lot of work because you have to deal with the vast informal sector, right? The informal sector is called informal because it is not properly regulated. I mean, you have markets, you have
Yeah, but I guess harmonization of the tax system is also one that they will need to work on, because if it's harmonized, there have been some taxpayers who have complained about that. Because harmonized is easier, for people to know what they're supposed to pay, who to pay, and when they're supposed to pay.
Yes, very, 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 very correct. The number of taxes as we speak is about 40-something. I mean, very high.
Yeah,
so
but more than 40-something% of profits, of corporates.
Exactly. So now, what part of the things the presidential fiscal reforms, tax reform, fiscal policy committee is doing is reducing the number of taxes, meaning examine the total number of taxes we have, the various taxes levies, right, and strike off the ones that are redundant, more or less, or the ones that are duplicated, right? So that's an issue, tax duplication. It affects ease of doing business for the small businesses, so they have to deal with a lot, levies here and there. You go to some states, you see economic development levy. Meanwhile, it's also collected at federal government level. So there's a whole lot of...
talk about harmonization. Thank you so much for your time. Partner at Tax Services, Stransact and Chartered Accountant, Mr. Victor Athe.